All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to be doing a deep dive today on this commentary that we found on an open letter about MGTOW, men going their own way.
Okay.
And I think it's going to really interesting because it really touches on a lot of these different perspectives of masculinity and
Yeah.
these sort of debates that are happening online right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And this commentary really jumps right into the fray. It pulls no punches and dives headfirst into this kind of heated debate between MGTOW and pickup artists and Save the West advocates.
Yeah, it's almost like they're all competing for like who is the most authentically masculine
Right. Yeah.
in
But
their approach.
yeah, the most valid way to be a man in the modern world.
And it's interesting because the open letter that is being commented on makes this distinction between like there's two kinds of MGTOW.
Yeah.
There's the guys who are genuinely like trying to define their lives on their own terms,
Right.
and then there's the guys who are maybe using it as a coping mechanism for their own romantic struggle.
Right. Yeah. You see that dynamic in a lot of different areas of life or philosophies or movements where there are people who are really bought into the core ideas, and then there are people who are, maybe joining the movement for, slightly less pure reasons.
Yeah.
And the commentator here, seems to agree with that and points out that, if you're starting from a place of resentment, you're probably not going to end up in a very productive place.
Right.
He even goes so far as to suggest that some content creators in the MGTOW space maybe focus on women-related topics, not necessarily because they're deeply bitter, but because that's what gets clicks and views.
Yeah.
It generates engagement.
It's what gets the algorithm going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, there's always that element of, are people really, expressing deeply held beliefs, or are they playing to an audience?
Right. And I think that's always a valid question to ask about any content creator or really anyone putting themselves out there.
Absolutely.
What stood out to me was the way this commentator kind of takes on the PUAs and the Save the West advocates.
Yeah.
And he seems to think that they're both trying to assert a certain kind of superiority over MGTOW.
Yeah, it's like, we have figured out the right way or the best way to be a man, and if you're not doing it this way, you're somehow doing it wrong.
Right.
The commentator argues that PUAs, they put so much emphasis on seduction skills as being, the ultimate marcher of masculinity.
Like if you can't get women, then you're not a real man.
Right, exactly. And then the Save the West advocates, they push this idea that, adhering to these traditional values is the only way to be a real man.
Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so a very narrow view of masculinity.
Yeah.
To reduce it down to just those two things.
I love the example that he gives of this Return of Kings, this website that was really big back in like 2016.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that whole thing?
I do. Yeah, it was very much tied into the whole Trump campaign. Yeah. And this idea that, the West was about to be restored. They had this kind of moment in the sun.
Yeah, like make Western civilization great again.
Yeah, exactly. But the commentator points out that, that momentum kind of fizzled out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And he suggests that, their content got really repetitive and kind of lost its quality, and so the platform declined. It's an interesting example of how, cultural moments can kind of come and go, even when they seem to have a lot of energy behind them.
Yeah, you wonder like what happens to the people who are swept up in those movements, when the tide turns.
Right. Where do they go from there?
Yeah. Where do they find that sense of belonging and purpose then?
Right.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's something that we'll dig into a little bit more as we continue this conversation.
Yeah. And it's interesting how, the commentator kind of brings it back to this idea of like social approval versus personal fulfillment.
Right.
And he seems to argue that, MGTOW at its core, it's about like prioritizing personal fulfillment over trying to seek validation from society or from other people.
Yeah, like instead of chasing external markers of success.
Right.
Like a high-paying job or a certain relationship status.
Like a wife and kids.
Yeah, exactly. They're more focused on defining what success means for them as individuals.
Right. So it's like their own internal kind of compass guiding their decisions.
Exactly.
But I mean, isn't there a risk that like by rejecting those societal expectations, you're just kind of creating another set of expectations?
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you're part of this NGTOW community, like isn't there pressure to conform to their specific definition of what it means to go your own way?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like, are we ever truly free from the influence of others, even when we're actively trying to like forge our own path?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So how do you strike a balance? Like, how do you pursue this personal fulfillment without completely isolating yourself
Oh.
or alienating yourself from like,
Yeah, and I think that's where it becomes really important to be mindful and intentional about your choices.
okay,
Like to be aware of, the pressures and expectations that are influencing you,
right.
but then ultimately making choices that are aligned with your values.
Your own value.
Yeah, even if those choices don't always conform to, what society says you should be doing.
So it's like you're not necessarily rejecting society altogether,
Right.
but you're just being more selective about what parts of it you're going to embrace.
Exactly.
It sounds like it
Yeah.
takes a lot of self-awareness and courage.
It does. It's definitely a journey, not a destination.
Yeah, so thinking about like the PUAs and the Save the West guys,
Yeah.
don't you think they're also kind of grappling with this tension between social approval and personal fulfillment just in different ways?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you could make the argument that, PUAs, they're seeking validation through seduction and conquest.
All right.
And the Save the West crowd, they're trying to find meaning in upholding these traditional values.
Right.
But in a way, they're all searching for a sense of belonging and purpose in a world that, you know, can feel increasingly fragmented and uncertain.
Like they're all trying to figure out how to be a man in the modern world.
Exactly. And I think what this commentary is trying to do is just encourage us to think critically about these different perspectives
Right.
and decide for ourselves what resonates with us.
It's like finding your own path, your own definition of masculinity,
Precisely.
regardless of what society tells you you should be.
Exactly.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. It's a message of empowerment
Yeah.
and self-discovery. And I think that's something that a lot of people are hungry for, regardless of their gender or their background.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's a very human thing.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've talked about, MGTOW, we've talked about PUAs, we've talked about Save the West advocates, and they're all kind of wrestling with this idea of, you know, what does it mean to be a man today? But like, what does that actually mean for the average person listening to this? What are the key takeaways that they can apply to their own lives?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways for me is this idea of like questioning assumptions.
Mm,
It's so easy to get caught up in these societal expectations about, what you should be doing with your life. Should you be focused on your career? Should you be, you know, getting married and having kids? All these kind of scripts that we're given about what it means to be successful and what it means to be a man. And I think what this commentary is urging us to do is just like take a step back and say, okay, what do I actually value? What actually brings me fulfillment, and am I living a life that's in alignment with those values?
yeah, those are some tough questions.
They are, and there's no easy answers, and the answers are probably going to be different for everybody.
Right.
But I think the point is to at least start asking those questions.
Yeah, it's like that whole idea of like, going your own way, but then also making sure that you're not just conforming to another set of expectations.
Right, exactly. It's like you don't want to just trade one set of dogma for another.
Right.
The real freedom comes from being able to think for yourself and make choices that are authentic to who you are.
So it's not really about like rejecting society altogether. It's
Yeah.
more about being like mindful and intentional
Exactly.
about your choices.
It's about creating a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling to you.
Yeah, and that might look different for everybody.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored the complexities of MGTOW. We've talked about the allure and the potential pitfalls of PUAs and Save the West advocates. And ultimately, I think what it all comes down to is this tension between social approval and personal fulfillment and figuring out how to navigate that tension in a way that feels authentic to you. So we hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another one.